It's a great pleasure to introduce you, Katharina. Katharina Inhetveen holds a chair in sociology at the University of Siegen in Germany. She studied sociology, social anthropology, and music sciences. Her research interests are in political sociology, sociology of violence, sociology of forced migration, of forced immobility, and qualitative research methods. Her geographical focus includes non-OECD countries and mainly Africa. Among her recent publications are the following books and papers. The paper Translation Challenges, Qualitative Interviewing in a Multilingual Field Towards a Body Sociology of Torture, and her book published in 2012 on 10, The Political Order of the Refugee Camp, Actors, Power, Organization, and Ethnography in Southern Africa, which is an extraordinary body of scholarship on refugee camps and a very intense and in-depth ethnography. Katharina, we are very happy to have you today in Minnesota spring. We cannot offer the true Minnesota experience. You missed it for 4 days, but maybe some other time. Please join me in welcoming Katharina Inhetveen. I have to explain, this is the mark of the sociology department, and this is a souvenir for every presenter at the workshop.
Thank you very much.
It's a mark of distinction.
Yeah, thank you very much for the nice introduction, and of course for the invitation to speak here, especially to the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies and the Department of Sociology, the Human Rights Program, and also the Center for Victims of Torture. It is great to see that so many people came. Thank you. I will today present some of my thoughts on torture, and I will concentrate on conceptual considerations as a basis for an empirical research that I'm still planning. So this is work in progress, and I'm especially looking forward to receiving your input during our discussion. The questions I ask are situated where the sociology of violence overlaps with the sociology of the body. My perspective may be quite German, not in a national sense, but with regard to academic discussions, because I follow conceptual leads that resulted from a controversy we had in the German-speaking sociology of violence. This debate was centered on the appropriate conceptualization of violence, as well as methodological problems. The leads or conceptual reference points I take from these debates include analyzing violent action itself in its dynamic detail, rather than processing it statistically as aggregated data. Trutz von Tota calls for a thick microscopy of violence as a basis for then achieving a rich analysis at the macro level. Looking closely at violent processes themselves includes also taking into consideration the role of the human body in violent interaction, as well as tracing the production and modification of meaning in connection with violent interactions. And finally, considering the connection between the body, pain, and the constitution and possibly destruction of the self. The sociology of violence is a heterogeneous field. Thus, these aspects are not as self-evident as they may seem. I therefore start with some conceptual clarifications which lead me to this German sociologist. Violence does confront us with the fact that human actors are embodied. At least it does so if we define violence through a physical quality. And I follow the definition proposed by Heinrich Popitz, who is probably not so well known in the US. In Germany, he is considered an undiscovered classic, as Ralph Dahrendorf put it. And Popitz concentrated his work on the basic conditions of human sociality, developed developing what is called sociological anthropology. So it's the very basic questions of sociology that he pursues. Especially his contributions on power and more specifically on violence are a central reference point for the German-speaking debate. He is not translated into English though. Popitz understands violence as an action of power which leads to the intentional bodily injury of others. This definition is deliberately narrow. Violence is seen as an action of power. This means an action aiming at carrying through one's will, also against resistance. You all know the definition by Max Weber. And in this sense, violence is also connected to a certain meaning defined by the violent actors, which might, of course, differ from the meaning attached to violence by the victims or third persons. Violence is also defined here as intentional, distinguishing this concept from unintentional harm done to other people. And here the definition reflects a theoretical stance that's based on the importance of human actors. And further, and maybe most importantly, yeah?
Can't there be violence against property as well as body?
I'm coming to that.
Okay.
Yes. And further, violence is here defined as hurting the body of others. That means the body of human beings. And thereby, Popitz is opposing his concept, namely to that of structural violence, as Johann Galtung proposed it. And finally, in this definition, the body is not affected in any arbitrary way, but it is purged. There is an injury, a violation. So, for analytic reasons, Popitz chooses to employ a very narrow definition, and in his works he also deals with harm done to material things, but it's not included in his concept of violence. In this sense, the human body is a means as well as a target of violence. As Popitz explicates, the body is the basis for the anthropological fact that human beings are open to physical violation, and at the same time they are capable of violating others. Human beings, and this is what you took up, human beings are also open to material and social injury connected to other forms of power, but physical injury stands out because we cannot disassociate ourselves from our body or replace our body the way we can, at least in principle, with regard to our material resources or even our social links. As violence exerts power over the body, it is inescapable for the whole person, because we are always connected to our body. When I talk about the body, the term does not only encompass the perceived anatomic body, the parts of which we can pinpoint and use instrumentally. It shall also encompass the body we feel, and which has flexible borders that are not necessarily the same as the anatomic borders like the skin. This differentiation is also a German-speaking one in a way, because it's denoted by the two German terms of Körper and Leib. Körper is thereby the cognitively perceived, anatomically defined instrumental body, or the body that we have. And Leib is the body that we feel, the felt body that we are. And using this differentiation, I refer to two scholars, namely Helmut Plessner and Hermann Schmitz, and including both notions into the concept of the body allows us for including in our analysis of violence such violations that hurt our body as we feel it, even if academic medicine would not observe any physical injuries. A case in point are certain kinds of sexualized violence, which do not imply any cuts or bruises or infections, and therefore they are also often difficult to prove in front of a court, but Nevertheless, they are bodily violations because they harm the life, the body as we feel it. In the title of my presentation, I refer to body knowledge. In the Cartesian tradition, one could assume an opposition between the body and knowledge, which is commonly associated with the realm of thinking. We are now decades after Pierre Bourdieu came up with the concept of incorporated cultural capital, so this Cartesian view might seem sociologically outdated, even though in everyday life it still has a great impact. Let me nevertheless add some remarks on body knowledge. The term body knowledge refers to two different relations between knowledge and the body. Firstly, there is knowledge about the body. This knowledge consists of cognitively reflected assumptions about the body. It is manifest, and thereby it can be systematized, and it is teachable. It includes, namely, what Keller and Moyser describe as specialized objectified body knowledge, namely the knowledge typical for professions and experts. Secondly, there is the knowledge in, or the knowledge by the body, the body's own knowledge manifested in habits, in skills, or in somatic reactions. It first of all includes what Keller and Moyser call lived experienced body knowledge, and this incorporated knowledge eludes cognitive reflection, because when it is cognitively reflected, it is transformed to knowledge about the body. Even though incorporated knowledge is teachable, it can be imparted to others in body-oriented training, such as training in handicraft, in dancing, or in martial arts. And as an aside, I recently experienced that the body actually, after several years of absence, still can produce correct movements, while the reflective mind still wonders how on earth this or that technique is supposed to be carried out. So the body has its own memory of movements, but also of sensations and feelings. These two types, knowledge about the body and incorporated knowledge, interact with each other, as can be observed, for example, in the cases of training I mentioned. Especially what Keller and Moyser call cultural body knowledge is tightly associated with this interaction. And thus, it coagulates both as incorporated body knowledge and in knowledge about the body. This cultural body knowledge includes gestalt-like body images, which are lived and reproduced as unconscious, incorporated knowledge, but also represented, reflected, and objectified as cultural over-individual knowledge about the body. So, after these conceptual remarks, where could we start researching torture as a body-related social practice? Obviously, we might turn to the sociology of the body, which has received increased attention since the 1990s, at least in Europe, but I guess also in the US. And it's now an established subdiscipline of sociology. However, the sociology of the body remains largely quiet about violence, with only a few exceptions, gender studies being among them. But generally, human bodies, as they are studied by the sociology of the body, do not touch each other much. When they interact, they remain at a physical distance. The role of the body in social relations is all but reduced to posture, movement, gestures, facial expression, and pitch of the voice, wearer of clothes, makeup, or tattoos. These are all things that are studied. So if the sociology of the body is anything to go by, the body does not experience much violence. Surely the body is disciplined, it is shaped by and reproduces class affiliation, and it has to respond to pressures of civilization. Otherwise, sociological research pictures the body in rather pleasant activities such as dancing, eating, doing sports, consuming and expressing identities. More specifically, in the sociology of the body, bodies do not torture and they are not tortured. This is if we do not want to inflate the concept of torture to encompass all sorts of biopower. However, it should, in my eyes, prove worthwhile for the sociology of the body to look at phenomena of torture. Torture is an empirical case which forces researchers to consider the own analytical weight of the body's materiality, as opposed to discourse analysis of a body as a mere carrier of textual inscriptions. Torture practices are confronted with and employ certain inescapable characteristics of the body. For the victim's body, these are its openness to injury, its capacity to feel pain, its capacity to react unintentionally and ungovernably, and last but not least, its inseparable connection with the mind and the self. On the side of the torturer, torture practices involve the bodily capacity to intentionally inflict injuries, thereby using the bodily capacity to resonate and to somatically understand pain and distress of others. Torturers use their body instrumentally, and of course they cannot separate their own body from their own self either. In torture constellations, there is generally also some third party involved, be it, for example, medical personnel that's often present, or superiors of the torturers which influence what is going on. This third is an important notion generally in the sociology of violence, but today it is not in my analytical focus. I just wanted to say that I'm not ignoring it. So I get to my next point, which is about the action problem of torture. Torture responds, as I see it, to a specific action problem. It's Handlungsproblem, is that, would you say action problem? Torture is a kind of instrumental political violence. Surely this instrumental aspect does not cover the whole phenomenon of torture, and moreover, torture can also develop its own momentum, which might lead away from its initial instrumental character. But, however, the instrumental dimension remains at the core of the concept and of the phenomenon. At its center is the aim to gain information or to punish and to break the victim. This is to destroy his or her previous identity. While punishment seems to be the older aim of torture historically, I will today focus on political torture as a means of gaining information. Here, the action problem of torture consists in forcing the victim to divulge information and to give up elements of his or her identity. This is breaking the victim. These two aims are not independent from each other. Forcing the victim to divulge information is also part of breaking the personality, and breaking the victim's personality is also instrumental in obtaining even more information. Whether this information is correct or not is not the question at this point. Torture attempts to reach these goals primarily by tormenting the victim's body. Thus, torture can be seen as a systematic and variable set of bodily practices. For torture to solve this action problem, the torturers are pointing to developing specific kinds of body knowledge. They have to learn about their victims' bodies, guided by the action problem of torture. So how is this body knowledge gained? One way would usually be scientific research. scientific production of knowledge encompassing theoretical reasoning and laboratory experiments. Another important source, however, are clearly the in situ practices where the torturers torture and thereby learn more about their body. The individual torturer learns in training and then later when he's just doing this, what he considers his job, obviously. One element in this learning process can also be the torturer's own bodily experience. As we know from the Greek case, the regime of the colonels, around 1970, 67 to 74, torturers may have experienced brutal treatment themselves during their training. In Greece, this practice was not only functional in breaking the self-determination, getting the trainees, so to speak, to follow senseless orders and making them see the tormenting of bodies as an everyday routine. It also functioned as a learning situation, giving the torturers in training a background knowledge about the body, in this case their own bodies, in pain. Even after such acts of violence are over, the body remains inevitably the carrier of violent experiences. Embodied knowledge, acquired through the torturer's own experience, in this case, can thus be converted into specialized body knowledge about their torture victims, which they encounter later. The torture-related body knowledge enters into a cultural over individual body image of torture, which is more gestalt-like. In the other direction, the body image structures the production of further body knowledge and practices of torture. This image sums up this triangle, so you get these three elements of the torture knowledge triangle, as I would call it, and they have impact upon each other. But I will get to that in more detail. It must be emphasized at this point that torture produces body knowledge not only on the side of the torturers, but also on the side of the torture victims. It becomes clear in reports of torture victims that torture forces them to experience their own body in new ways. In this unimaginable situation of torture, they register how their own body feels and reacts, and they come to know it in a different way. As the Greek example shows, transfer of body knowledge between the different positions is possible to a certain degree, and this transfer is based on our bodily capacity to resonate physical experiences. Thus, when I focus on the body knowledge on the side of the torturers now, it has to be kept in mind that this is only one part of a more encompassing picture. Surveying empirical torture practices, we can differentiate between three ways in which torturers approach their victims or the victim's body. Each of these ways is connected to an area of body knowledge that is relevant for the action problem of torture. The first is knowledge about how can one inflict violence on the human body painfully and efficiently without killing the victim. The second area is knowledge about tormenting by withdrawal. It answers to the question about what can one withdraw from the body to effect a act that will cause the victim's body to experience distress and pain. And thirdly, torturers gain and employ knowledge about leaving the victim's body to its own functions and physical operation or properties. Nothing is actively inflicted or withdrawn except for the victim's possibility to react upon the own body's inevitable functions. In this area of techniques, the question relevant for torture practices is how can one turn the victim's body against the victim, her or himself. The first of these areas of body knowledge, that of inflictions, quickly comes to mind when one regards torture as a specific kind of violence. The act of infliction is, as I said, central to common concepts of violence such as the one of Heinrich Popitz. Violence is done to somebody. However, the action problem of torture is more complex than just to violate the victim anyhow. In torture, action power pairs up with what Popitz calls instrumental power. This is to carry through one's will with the use of threats and sometimes promises. The victim is both heard and threatened, and often the actual pain is also a threat of repeated or even increased pain. For this intricate combination of torment and threat, the torturers must be able to inflict pain which is continuously and controllably variable over time. Also, it must be possible to increase it up to extreme pain, but also this must all happen without killing the victim. It is no coincidence that in the devices used to inflict this controlled, variable, potentially extreme but not deadly pain, we often come across screws and wheels. The well-known thumb screw bears this in its name. With a screw, you can adjust the level of pain. So, yeah. For example, we can look at a protocol from 1672 of the torturing of Katharina Lips, on whom the so-called Spanish gaiter was used. This is the device you put on the legs. The torturers varied the strain of the left and the right screw, put the device higher and higher up the leg, knocked on the screws, and in addition, the torture master stabbed her with a needle to test if she was a witch. Her head was shaved and she was hung on her hands and feet. When she begged to be beaten to death, her wish was not fulfilled. This protocol gives evidence of the interlaced application of varying, increasing and decreasing pain, threats, and verbal prodding to confess. While the human body is open to violations in countless ways, the aim of torture to destroy identities makes certain contact points more relevant for the torturers than others. In this regard, body openings are particularly significant. Especially in connection with sexualized acts of penetration, targeting body openings does not only allow the torturers to inflict immense pain, but to attack the self of the victim in the most profound ways. The respective body knowledge is manifested by early torture instrument as the pair of anguish, which is put into the mouth of the victim, or the Judas cradle. It becomes also apparent in electroshocks to genitals or rectum, and it is also obvious in cases of rape as a systematic means of torture. Many torture practices during the witch hunts left the victims permanently crippled, even though such irreversible damages were explicitly forbidden by law. Today, however, torturers face a modified action problem. In addition to the one I outlined, it became more and more important not to leave visible and permanent injuries. This constricts the torturers to more specific practices, which again require additional body knowledge. They have to know where and how to beat the victim without leaving permanent traces. They have to know how and where to apply electric shocks, and they have to do without a large array of technical instruments that previously cut limbs, broke bones, crushed and teared out body parts. Regardless of this shift in the action problem, the body image connected with torture techniques of infliction remains basically the same, the image of the vulnerable vulnerable body that is open to violation. The second realm of torture, with a corresponding area of body knowledge, consists in depriving the victim of material and sensory input. Heinrich Popitz does bring up the topic of withdrawal, but only in connection with material and social deprivation. However, when torturers have total control over the victim's body, withdrawal can assume a very direct bodily form. In recent use, where techniques as temporarily restricted air supply, waterboarding being one of the well-known examples, deprivation of water and food, prolonged sleep withdrawal, deprivation of visual and audio stimuli, be it by darkness or by light, by silence or loud music or noise, avoidance of comfortable temperatures, be it by very warm or very cold circumstances, and the denial of human contacts, apart from the contacts with the interrogators and the guards, who often even wear masks. For example, all of us have probably seen some of the infamous pictures of sensory deprivation. Some are from a research setting, so this is from research aimed at finding out what happens if we take all sensory input from a human being. But we also, of course, know the pictures of the operational settings where these techniques were put in use. There are two rationales behind this increasing emphasis on techniques of withdrawal. One is the reasoning that inflictions of painful violence may remain superficial, and they may even increase the victim's resistance. This reservation against classic torture techniques using the infliction of injury are formulated already in a CIA manual from 1963, while of course the authors do not talk about torture there, but about counterintelligence interrogation of resistant sources. Withdrawals in contact not only make the victim suffer, but they effectively reduce her or his psychological ability to resist by breaking his or her identity and inducing what research during the Cold War called the Triple D syndrome, which stands for debility, dependency, and dread. By withdrawing physical stimuli and material that the body needs to function also, the whole system of the body, mind, and emotions are tolerated. The second reason why techniques of deprivation are increasingly emphasized is that they hardly leave visible traces, which of course does not mean that they do not have long-term effects. As mentioned, the increasing international attention to human rights violations changes the action problem of torturers and poses an incentive to circumnavigate accusations of torture by keeping the effects invisible. To achieve this, torturers are referred to medical expertise. This is to a certain type of professional body knowledge. Documents as the ICRC report on the treatment of 14 high-value detainees in CIA custody illuminate the important role of medical personnel in today's torture practices. The increased targeting of bodily needs rather than the fragilities of body parts corresponds with a shifting of the underlying body image from a vulnerable body that is open to violation to a needy body, a body that has needs, and by withdrawal we can harm the body. The third realm of torture techniques and corresponding body knowledge concerns using the victim's own body to torment him or her by leaving the body without an opportunity to act and thus subjecting it to its own functions. A precondition for this is usually an immobilization of the body. Common examples are found also in this ICRC report I mentioned, such as prolonged cuffing and shackling in one position, be it stressed standing with the hands over the head, sitting in a chair or being tied to a bed, or confinement in boxes of different sizes. Without any further external influence, the immobilized body starts to hurt. Muscles and joints ache, limbs swell, skin breaks or develops blisters and wounds. According to the CIA interrogation manual from 1963, pain is more effective when the victim inflicts it upon him or herself. The manual says, it has been plausibly suggested that, whereas pain inflicted on a person from outside himself may actually focus or intensify his will to resist, his resistance is likelier to be sapped by pain when he seems to inflict, which he seems to inflict upon himself. Such as Weiss describes, in the 1960s, the CIA had come to prefer so-called non-coercive methods centered on self-inflicted pain and self-punishment to induce regression and self-blame. In addition, the immobilized body is often left to its excrement with no opportunity to deal with the inevitable urine, feces, menstrual blood, and maybe vomit. Even when, for example, a bucket is provided, the victim can be denied material to clean him or herself after using the toilet. More generally, it is often denied that the victim can clean the own body. Not only does denying hygiene result in bodily discomfort and, in the long run, also bodily pain. As Merrick Douglas has shown, there is a connection between the degree of civilized handling and neutralization of bodily functions on the one hand, and social status on the other hand. According to her analysis, a tight control of the body and its functions signalizes a high social position, a high position in a social hierarchy. Thus, also hygiene becomes a marker of social status. And if we follow her reasoning, it becomes clear how subjecting the victim's body to its own functions, this is leaving it in its own excrement, getting dirty and stinking, means a social degradation and an attack on the victim's self. Thus, taking away the means of handling one's body functions in a way the victim sees as civilized can be employed as a systematic torture practice. The body image underlying this approach of torture emphasizes the body's own momentum. Rather than its openness for violations or its needs of material or sensory input, the human body's productivity is highlighted, and thus its employability or the employability of its inner processes for the task of torture. Torture techniques turn the productive body into a self-destructive body. We can see that when we look at two final images, this one you all will know, and it shows us that we often find combinations of all three types of torture practices. Here you have the vulnerable body manifest in the threat of electric shocks. You have the needy body, you see a deprivation of visual stimuli, and there's also the self-destructive body. So this man also suffered from seemingly self-induced pain by this stress position he's standing in. And he was told if he steps down, he will get electric shocks. Such combinations of infliction, deprivation, and subjecting the body to its own functions are not a recent phenomenon. This picture of an Iron Maiden shows at least a combination of infliction. You see these pikes that are at the inside of the device, and also withdrawal of light. Whether there is also a subjection to the body's own functions could be disputed, but at least two of the three approaches are present also in this technique. Yeah, I was reminded that this event today is actually a workshop, and this is good for me because I'm not going to provide you with prêt-à-porter results, but rather I will formulate a couple of research questions that are based on this consideration I presented. These questions are meant to form a starting point for systematic empirical analysis, and I'm looking forward to your input in the subsequent discussion. The first question pertains to precise mechanisms by which specialized body knowledge, cultural body images, and concrete torture practices influence each other. So this is this triangle again. To find answers, one will also have to ask how torture-relevant body knowledge is transferred between victims, torturers, and third actors involved. Especially in understanding this transfer of embodied knowledge, in cases of violence, research still has a lot of work to do. A first task will be to dimensionalize the concepts of body image, body knowledge, and torture practice, which I up to now treated as one-dimensional units somehow. For example, dimensionalizing cultural body images would include asking for the interpretation of the individual body's relation to society and to the cosmos, or asking for the cultural interpretation of different body parts and body regions with regard to their ascribed vulnerability or strength or danger, their sexualization and their association with shame, for example, or asking for bodily, gender, and age stereotypes. A second area of questions refers to the relation of universality versus cultural diversity of torture practices. While torture generally responds to and also employs anthropological qualities of the human body in general, we do find a considerable variety in concrete torture practices in history and around the world. On an abstract level, and based on general anthropological characteristics, similar solutions are found to the action problem of torture, focused at tormenting the body by using techniques that allow for continuously adjustable anguish. When comparing torture practices in different cultures, however, we find that they differ from each other. Each cultural set of torture practices is connected to specific body knowledge, which is employed with particular contents or emphasis, and corresponding to culturally specific body images. This is the more gestalt-like interpretations. Thus, the body images underlying torture vary between different societies, and body knowledge and torture practices vary with them, co-vary with them, you can say. The corresponding research question would be how body knowledge, body images, and torture practices in different cultures differ systematically from each other, and which common denominators may be found. As we know, however, it is not so easy to compare cultures as if they were separate entities, isolated from each other. This leads to a third question. How do body knowledge and body images change when torture practices, but also influencing factors as human rights movements, for example, travel around the world? And how may the practices themselves be modified according to the local